On the morning of May 26, 1990, Marlene Warren, aged 40, was in her home in Wellington, Florida, preparing breakfast for her 21-year-old son, Joseph Joe Ahrens, and several of his friends. Wellington was a suburban community in Palm Beach County, where families lived in quiet residential neighborhoods. Ahrens was at home recovering from a broken leg, and the group was gathered in the kitchen when a vehicle pulled into the driveway around 10:45 a.m., witnesses later recalled. Through the glass of the front door, Joe and his friends saw a white Chrysler LeBaron convertible stop in the driveway. A person wearing a clown costume, complete with an orange wig, red bulb nose, and painted-on makeup, exited the vehicle carrying a basket of flowers and 2 balloons. One of the balloons reportedly featured an image of Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, while the other bore the words, "You're the greatest," investigators later noted. Marlene Warren was known to enjoy clowns and had decorative clown paintings in her home. As she answered the door to accept the apparent gifts, one of the balloons and the flowers in her hands, she commented, "Oh, how pretty," according to eyewitness accounts. Within seconds, the person in the clown disguise pulled a handgun and fired 1 shot at Warren's face at point-blank range. She collapsed inside the foyer. Joe Ahrens and his friends immediately called 911. Paramedics and deputies from the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office responded. Warren was rushed to a local hospital, where she survived for 2 days before succumbing to her injuries. The medical examiner determined that the gunshot wound had caused irreversible damage and that her death was the direct result of the shooting. The sheriff's office classified the incident as a homicide. The initial investigation in 1990 focused on reconstructing the events leading up to the killing. Detectives secured the scene, collected physical evidence, and interviewed witnesses. Items recovered included the abandoned white convertible, later found in a parking lot of a nearby Winn-Dixie grocery store roughly 8 miles from the crime scene, and fibers consistent with a clown's orange wig and clothing. Long brown hair found inside the car added to the evidence pool, although the biological material available at the time could not be conclusively analyzed with the forensic tools of the early 1990s. Investigators immediately considered potential suspects. Early in the investigation, attention focused on Marlene's then-husband, Michael Warren, who had a business relationship with an employee named Sheila Keene. Police learned that vested interest might exist because of the couple's marital problems and the relationship between Michael and Keene. Witnesses told detectives that Michael and Keene took long lunches together, and rumors circulated that they were involved in an affair around the time of the murder. Detectives also learned that someone matching Keene's description had purchased a clown costume and related items shortly before the shooting. Despite these leads, investigators at the time were unable to develop sufficient probable cause to arrest any suspect. Michael Warren had an alibi placing him out of the area at the time of the killing, and Sheila Keene denied involvement. Detectives learned from costume shop employees that a person matching Keene's appearance had purchased a clown suit days before the homicide, and grocery store clerks later identified her as having purchased flowers and balloons around that same time. Still, without definitive forensic evidence or additional corroboration, prosecutors declined to file charges, and the case gradually went cold. For nearly 3 decades, the investigation remained unresolved. The sheriff's office maintained the case file and preserved the physical evidence, including the fibers, hair samples, and other trace materials recovered from the abandoned car and associated locations. Detectives periodically reviewed the case as forensic science advanced, hoping that future methods would make it possible to extract more information from existing evidence. In 2014, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office reactivated the investigation through its cold case unit. The unit re-examined old witness statements and evidence, and applied newer forensic techniques that had emerged in the years since the original inquiry. Investigators also re-interviewed witnesses and pursued investigative angles that had not been fully explored in 1990. One significant development involved advances in DNA analysis and evidence comparison methods unavailable at the time of the murder. Forensic scientists revisited the orange wig fibers, hairs, and other trace materials associated with the abandoned Chrysler LeBaron and the ribbons tied to the balloons carried by the clown. Newer technology made it possible to link fibers and hair samples to individuals with a degree of certainty previously unattainable. Investigators also discovered that Sheila Keene, long a person of interest, had married Michael Warren in 2002, 12 years after Marlene's death. The couple moved to Abingdon, Virginia under new lives and operated a restaurant together.
Police theorized that Keene's familiarity with clowns and her connection to Michael might have factored into the planning of the 1990 killing, though prosecutors noted that evidence must be developed within legal standards. In September 2017, nearly 27 years after the murder, investigators located and arrested Sheila Keene Warren at her residence in Virginia. She was taken into custody without incident and extradited to Palm Beach County to face charges related to Marlene Warren's death. Law enforcement officials said that advances in forensic evidence, including DNA links and fiber comparisons, made the arrest possible. Prosecutors initially charged Sheila Keene Warren with first-degree murder. She faced the possibility of a life sentence or capital punishment under Florida law. Her bail was set, and she awaited trial as the court process unfolded. Given the age of the case and complexity of the evidence, legal proceedings involved motions regarding admissibility of statements and scientific findings. On April 25, 2023, Sheila Keene Warren entered a plea of guilty to second-degree murder in connection with the shooting of Marlene Warren. At the plea hearing, her defense maintained that she was not responsible, but prosecutors presented the case they had developed through the re-examination of evidence, witness testimony, and forensic findings. The court accepted the plea, after which she was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The judge in the case credited Sheila Keene Warren for the time she had spent in custody since her 2017 arrest, as required under Florida sentencing guidelines. This reduced the amount of additional time she was to serve after the plea and sentencing. Records from the Florida Department of Corrections later indicated that she was released from prison in November 2024, about 18 months after entering her guilty plea. The resolution of the case marked the end of one of Palm Beach County's most notorious cold cases. The manner in which the crime was carried out, a person in a clown costume presenting flowers and balloons before shooting the victim at close range, was widely described in media and public accounts as unprecedented and shocking. The unusual nature of the killing captured national attention both at the time and decades later when the case was finally solved. While the murder was resolved through plea and sentencing, the case left lingering questions in public discussion about motive and association. Authorities stated that Michael Warren was not charged in connection with the homicide, though investigator interest in potential involvement existed early in the case. Prosecutors and law enforcement emphasized that the focus remained on establishing which individual had committed the act with the evidence available. Marlene Warren's son, Joe Ahrens, later spoke publicly after the resolution, expressing that although the guilty plea provided a degree of closure, the short length of the sentence was difficult for him to reconcile, given the impact of his mother's death on his life and family. The Marlene Warren cold case illustrates how long unsolved crimes can eventually be resolved through the preservation of evidence, advances in forensic technology, and persistent investigative effort. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office credited the combination of meticulous early investigative work and modern evidence analysis with finally identifying and prosecuting the person responsible for a homicide that had remained unsolved for more than 2 decades.
On January 30, 1976, 32-year-old Karen Klass returned to her home in Hermosa Beach, California, after dropping her 4-year-old child off at daycare. Klass had 2 young sons and had been divorced for several years from singer Bill Medley of the music duo The Righteous Brothers. It was a Saturday morning, and her routine that day appeared ordinary when she returned home. A short time later, she was violently attacked in her residence on Loma Drive. Neighbors became concerned when they were unable to contact Klass or her children later in the day. One neighbor who went to check on her residence found signs of a struggle. They called authorities. Responding officers from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department entered the home and found Klass unresponsive. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with her own pantyhose. Evidence showed she had suffered other physical trauma during the assault. Klass was transported from the scene to a local hospital. She remained alive but in a coma for several days following the attack. Despite medical efforts, she never regained consciousness and died on February 4, 1976. The medical examiner's report confirmed that her death was a result of the assault. Investigators classified her killing as a homicide. In the immediate investigation following the discovery of her body, homicide detectives canvassed the neighborhood and interviewed potential witnesses. 2 independent witnesses reported seeing a shaggy-haired white male in a trench coat and blue jeans leaving Klass's home shortly after the likely time of the assault. Despite detailed descriptions, investigators were unable to locate this man or develop a positive identification. Detectives ruled out Klass's new husband at the time of the murder as a suspect after examining his alibi and statements. Her divorce from Medley had occurred about 6 years earlier, and official statements indicated that Medley was not considered a suspect. The case nevertheless drew significant attention due to Klass's connection to a public figure and the brutal nature of the crime.
Throughout 1976 and the late 1970s, the investigation encountered few solid leads. The forensic capabilities of the time were limited. Investigators collected physical evidence from the scene, including biological material, but there was no established method at the time to comprehensively analyze DNA. The homicide unit maintained the case file, and officers continued periodic reviews as additional investigative resources allowed. In the 1990s, forensic science began advancing towards more refined DNA analysis. Detectives in Los Angeles County revisited cold cases using developing DNA methods when possible. In 1999, the Sheriff's Department released additional composite descriptions of the man seen leaving Klass's home, hoping that further public attention might generate information. Around that time, investigators used early DNA profiling methods to eliminate several suspects, but they were still unable to match the profile to an individual in the national databases then in use. By the 2000s, DNA testing techniques had become more sensitive, but the killer's DNA collected from the scene still did not yield a match in the growing national DNA databases. Investigators maintained the biological profile of the man responsible and continued to store the evidence in hopes that future developments might allow a breakthrough. Beginning in the mid-2000s and continuing into the 2010s, law enforcement agencies, including the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, began exploring newer forensic approaches. One of these methods was familial DNA searching, a technique that allows investigators to search DNA databases for partial matches that could indicate a close relative of an unknown suspect. This method was controversial, as it relied on identifying potential relatives rather than exact matches, but law enforcement officials argued it was a valuable tool for unsolved violent crimes. Investigators conducted a familial DNA search in 2011, but did not identify a strong lead at that time. The technology was still emerging, and databases did not yet contain the necessary breadth of profiles to generate useful familial connections. Despite this setback, detectives continued to preserve the DNA evidence and review potential leads when possible. In 2016, decades after the homicide, renewed efforts to apply advanced DNA techniques were undertaken. Investigators re-entered the preserved DNA profile from the crime scene into updated systems that allowed broader familial comparisons. This time, the search produced a familial match to a relative of the suspect. Based on the genetic link and corroborating investigative information, detectives identified Kenneth Eugene Troyer as the individual responsible for the murder of Karen Klass. Troyer, born in 1946, had a known criminal history that included several sexual assault cases in Southern California. He had been convicted of burglary and was serving time when he escaped from a California prison in early 1982. Following his escape, Troyer was involved in a confrontation with law enforcement and was shot and killed by police in March 1982 in Orange County, California. Because he died before modern DNA databases were fully operational, his genetic profile had never been collected and entered into the system at the time of his death. Investigators obtained a preserved sample of Troyer's DNA from the Orange County Coroner's Office, where it had been archived following his death. Forensic comparison confirmed that Troyer's DNA matched the DNA collected from the crime scene in Klass's home. This conclusive scientific link provided certainty that Troyer was the person who assaulted and killed Karen Klass in 1976. The identification of Troyer came nearly 41 years after the homicide, making it one of the longest-running cold cases to be resolved in the Hermosa Beach area. At a news conference announcing the breakthrough, law enforcement officials explained that the use of familial DNA was key to identifying the suspect. They noted that all other investigative avenues had been exhausted prior to the successful DNA match. During the press announcement, former husband Bill Medley spoke about the impact of the resolution on his family. Medley, who had remained close to Klass as a friend after their divorce, expressed that learning the killer's identity brought closure to a chapter of their lives that had remained unresolved for decades. He acknowledged that the case had weighed on him and his sons, and the breakthrough provided a measure of relief after many years. Members of Klass's family, including her sons, attended the press conference with law enforcement, marking the first time they had publicly heard the name of the person responsible for her death. They described the identification as a moment of closure, though they noted that no legal proceedings could follow because Troyer had been deceased for decades. The Karen Klass cold case exemplifies the evolution of forensic science and its application to long unsolved crimes. In 1976, law enforcement lacked the tools to link biological evidence definitively to a suspect. Over the subsequent decades, DNA technology advanced from basic profiling to familial searching and expanded database access, allowing investigators to make connections that were previously impossible. The persistence of homicide detectives in preserving evidence and periodically re-evaluating the case with updated methods was central to the eventual resolution. Preservation of the crime scene evidence and a comprehensive record of the investigation enabled later comparisons and ultimately a conclusive match. In statements regarding the case, officials emphasized that cold cases, particularly those involving violent crimes with biological evidence, may be resolved many years after the fact when technology and databases improve. They encourage law enforcement agencies to maintain evidence and remain vigilant for emerging forensic tools that can provide answers for families and communities. The identification of Kenneth Eugene Troyer as Karen Klass's killer closed a chapter of uncertainty that lasted more than 4 decades. While no criminal prosecution could occur due to Troyer's death in 1982, the scientific confirmation of his involvement provided a definitive conclusion to a long-standing mystery and offered the victim's family a degree of closure that had eluded them for decades.